Great. Tēnā koutou ko Matt Raeburn toko anyoa. I'm from the Ministry for the Environment in the Climate Directorate, formerly of the ETS team, now currently with the Climate Resilience team. What I wanted to do is kind of set the broader context from a climate policy standpoint of a lot of the issues that you're going to face as proponents of EVs. So I'll just go ahead and launch right into it. So right up there you can see our most recent greenhouse gas inventory published in April of this year. It's up through the year, it's for the year 2017. Our 2030 target under the Paris Agreement, our nationally determined contribution, is 30% below 2005 emissions levels. In 2017, emissions levels were about what they were in 2005. Transport is in that bottom left-hand corner there at 19.7% of emissions. Road transport, that subsection further out in the bottom left-hand corner, 17.9% of emissions. A lot of other things in there. Agriculture is all that blue. You also have manufacturing, industrial processes, waste. I want to go ahead and talk about the way that we price emissions in New Zealand. That's through the emission trading scheme, or the ETS. Right now, the price of a New Zealand emission unit, NZU, is about $23 a ton. It's capped at $25 currently, although that may change in the near future with the passage of the zero carbon bill, which I'll get to in a second. Agriculture, fairly recently it was announced that the policy of the government will be to phase in agriculture into the ETS starting in 2005, and at that time 95% of those emissions will be subsidized. So an agriculture participant will only have to pay 5% of that carbon price. Consultations going on for that now, by the way, if you have a view about whether or not that is ambitious enough. Industrial processes, waste, manufacturing, those are facing a lot of technological challenges to reducing their emissions, as is agriculture. But one of the important things from an emission trading scheme point of view is that many of those sectors receive things called industrial allocations. And just yesterday there was a new policy announced on how industrial allocations are going to be very slowly phased out. Industrial allocations, for those who don't know, is basically subsidized carbon pollution. The policy rationale is that if we don't subsidize carbon pollution for certain industries, they will just take up and leave New Zealand. BP does not need to sell their oil to our small Pacific Island nation. So if we don't subsidize their industries, that they can go. Refining New Zealand, other transport fuels receive a lot of subsidies from these industrial allocations. And the announcement that came out yesterday evening is that we're going to start decreasing those industrial allocation amounts by just 1% per year starting in 2021. Originally, it was supposed to start about a decade ago when the Climate Change Response Act was passed. So that's how relatively slowly we're going to start phasing those down. So kind of the point I'm trying to make here is that the government has basically said through their policies that they have announced that agriculture emissions are basically going to be more or less off limits, and a lot of those subsidized areas also aren't going to be severely impacted from the carbon price. So if we want to get to that 2030 target of 30% below 2005 levels, a lot of those gains have to come from road transport in order for it to realistically happen. The zero carbon bill, which is currently in select committee, also sets a 2050 net zero emissions target, except for biogenic methane, which has a much lower target. And it's going to do a bunch of other things to help facilitate that process, but that 2030 target I think is particularly key. Note that this does not include New Zealand's consumption emissions. When I was working for the state of Oregon previously, we did include our consumption emissions, the idea being that if a car battery for an EV is made in China from rare earth metals that are extracted in China, that we buying that in Oregon or here in New Zealand, we're the ones who actually own those emissions. But that's not the way that we do it for right now. Otherwise, that calculus about the emission benefits of EVs could change a bit. Also, there are many ways to decarbonize road transport. EVs are not the only way. There's also mode shifting and things like that. So something to keep in mind. I want to talk about the climate change resilience aspects of the zero carbon bill, and these are things that are already underway. There's the National Climate Change Response Act, the National Climate Change Risk Assessment, where we're going to be doing a broad overview of all of the climate change risks in New Zealand. It's going to be broad, it's going to be national, but not like nationwide. But the idea is to get like a broad assessment of the kinds of risks New Zealand is facing. We have a framework for that risk assessment already developed. We're going to start work on that next month, the actual risk assessment itself, and it should be done within the next year. In addition to looking at a lot of like local government type risks, we're also going to be getting information from what are called lifeline utilities, which includes electricity and transport and energy. So we're going to be seeking information from those utilities on their risks as well. Something to keep in mind when you're thinking about the infrastructure that's going to be needed for the transition to EVs. After the National Climate Change Risk Assessment, within 2 years after that's published, we need to produce a national adaptation plan that will prioritize essentially the ways in which we respond to climate change as a country. There's also in the ZCB a reporting power that allows us to request information from both local governments and these lifeline utilities so that we can have a better sense of what their risks are. So again, think about that when you're thinking about the kinds of infrastructure that's going to be needed for EVs. Okay. There's a lot of co-benefits to switching to EVs from internal combustion engines as well. And they all just popped up. So improving air quality is a big one. Modeling shows that about 27 deaths per 100,000 people are the result of particulate matter, which is produced significantly by vehicles, particularly in urban areas. Buses and vans, if you can electrify those will have very high gains for human health. The trucks, even though they pollute more particulate matter, they're not operating in urban areas the way that buses and vans are. If we're going to be the best place to have a child, that's a big thing that we should be thinking about, is how we can take that particulate matter out of the air that they breathe. Noise pollution, the World Health Organization estimates that about 1 million years of healthy life per year is lost in Western Europe alone from traffic noise. It is a big deal. It has a huge impact. Most EVs, pretty quiet, so that's pretty helpful. EVs are still vehicles though, by the way, so before you think that EVs can, before you go too far with the EVs can save lives, they are still vehicles. It's not the safest method of transportation. There is the possibility though, if you have self-driving EVs, for that risk to be mitigated. Something to think about as well. And then the broader resilience implications of EVs. There is a case to be made, and we don't know for sure whether or not this is accurate, but we'll see hopefully after the climate change risk assessment is completed, that there are resilience benefits to EVs. You can have potentially EVs on distributed generation, solar power, charging that, so it's not hooked up to a grid. That's a bit more resilient than something that is dependent on a global supply chain of fossil fuel, which has many different weak points. I mean, just in New Zealand alone, we have one refinery in Marsden Point on the sea, and 58% of all of our petrol comes through there. We saw what happened with the pipe leakage recently, about how vulnerable that can be. The delivery infrastructure for getting fuel around New Zealand depends on roads and petrol stations. All of that is potentially vulnerable. You could, in theory at least, make it more resilient if you had EVs. That's another argument not to take too far, because as you saw from Kaikoura, if there's a natural disaster or a climate impacted disaster that takes out a road, EVs are still vehicles, so that can only help you so much. So in summary, EVs will play potentially a huge role in getting to that next 2030 target. So this next 10 years is really crucial, and don't wait until 2028, because you need to start making those changes now. We need to start making those changes now. Potentially resilience positives to EVs, and we'll hopefully be able to get more of an idea of how positive from the National Climate Change Risk Assessment. And the co-benefits are pretty substantial, undeniable that there will be health benefits to getting rid of air pollution from EVs and noise pollution. That's all I got. Thanks. The zero carbon bill also, by the way, has not passed yet, and that is not a certainty. We all hope it will, but But in the meantime, we do have that 2030 target of 30% of emissions reductions by 2005. That does cover all gases.